Night has settled fully upon the Nile Valley. The river glows faintly under the silver touch of the moon, its surface rippling with the movements of unseen fish. In the village, fires are extinguished one by one, leaving only the dim orange glow of embers. Families retreat inside, where they lie close together for warmth despite the heat of the day. The air is cooler now, carrying the soft rustle of reeds in the wind, and the occasional distant cry of a bird that hunts in the dark. Sleep comes quickly to the weary, but it is not always peaceful. Dreams in ancient Egypt were thought to be messages from the gods, and many people awoke at night with a sense of unease, wondering if their visions carried warnings. A dream of a crocodile, perhaps, might suggest danger from the river. A dream of falling sand could mean sickness. Priests and wise women were sometimes consulted to interpret such things, though most villagers could only pray quietly and hope the meaning was not ill. The morning comes again, as it always does, with light pouring across the horizon. The work resumes, and so we begin to see the shape of a life here, one built upon endless repetition. To the modern ear, it may sound monotonous, but to the people of Egypt, it was life itself. Change was not often welcome. Stability was the goal. A good flood, a fair harvest, the safety of one's family, these were the highest hopes for most Egyptians. The grandeur of the pharaoh's conquests or the rise of temples mattered little compared to whether the bread was enough to last until next season. The diet of the ordinary person was simple, yet it kept them alive. Barley and emmer wheat were ground into flour on stone slabs, then baked into dense loaves of bread. The grinding itself was brutal work, often done by women or servants, who spent hours each day bent over heavy. Their knees and hands were worn down by the effort, their joints aching from the repetitive strain. The bread, coarse and gritty with bits of stone from the grinding process, wore down the teeth of nearly every Egyptian. Skulls found by archaeologists often showed teeth ground flat, cracked, or infected. Pain in the mouth was a constant reality, endured with no real remedy. To drink, there was beer, though not like ours today. Egyptian beer was thick, more like porridge than liquid, made from fermented barley bread. It was nourishing, full of calories, and provided much of the energy needed for labor. Children drank it too, as water was often unsafe. Alongside bread and beer came onions, leeks, garlic, lentils, and, when luck allowed, fish from the Nile. Meat was rare, reserved for festivals or the wealthier classes. Most meals were repetitive, but in a land where famine was always possible, repetition was a comfort. The clothes they wore were equally simple. Linen was the fabric of choice, woven from flax grown along the river. For the poor, garments were plain and often little more than a single piece of cloth draped and tied around the body. Men wore short kilts, women long dresses, sometimes held by straps over the shoulders. In the relentless heat, this was all that could be tolerated. Children often went without clothing at all until they were older. Sandals, made of reeds or leather, were a luxury many could not afford, and so bare feet met the hot ground each day. There was little room for comfort. Yet there was a quiet dignity in this simplicity. Jewelry, when available, added touches of beauty: strings of beads, carved amulets, small charms believed to ward off evil. Even the poorest might carry a protective charm shaped like an eye, or a small figurine of a god. These little tokens gave reassurance, a way to believe that the unseen world might guard them against harm. But belief also demanded fear. The gods of Egypt were mighty and unpredictable. Ra, the sun, sailed across the sky each day, but if balance were broken, he might not rise. The Nile, guided by Hopi, might flood too much or too little if not honored. Anubis watched over the dead, Osiris judged them, and countless other deities watched every action. For the people, life was filled with ritual, prayers, and offerings. A mother might leave a bit of bread on a small household altar, asking for her child's safety. A farmer might pour a trickle of beer into the soil before planting, hoping to please the earth. The brutality of life was softened, in some ways, by this ever-present faith. It gave meaning to suffering, turned hardship into part of a cosmic balance. To endure hunger, to endure sickness, was not meaningless, it was part of a larger story, one that stretched from the Nile's edge to the stars above. Yet, even with this comfort, life expectancy was short. Many never lived beyond their 30s. Children died often. Women faced constant danger in childbirth, and disease, invisible and unstoppable, cut through villages with ease. Without doctors as we know them, Egyptians relied on herbs, charms, and incantations. A wound might be wrapped in honey, believed to ward off infection. A fever might be treated with garlic or willow. Sometimes it worked. Often it did not. The priests who served in temples were healers too, but their remedies mixed spiritual and practical measures, leaving survival to chance as much as skill. Still, life went on, carried forward by resilience. Families found joy in the simplest of things, a festival where music and dancing filled the air, a cool dip in the river after a long day, the taste of dates or figs shared among children. At night, when the stars blazed brighter than any modern city ever allows us to see, they looked up and told stories. They spoke of gods sailing the heavens, of journeys through the underworld, of eternal fields where the blessed dead would one day rest. The children, lying on mats beside their parents, listened with wide eyes. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against mud-brick walls. Outside, the desert stretched silent and vast. A jackal's distant cry broke the quiet for a moment, then faded. Within the home, there was safety, warmth, and a moment of peace. For all its brutality, life in ancient Egypt was still life, filled with laughter, fear, love, and hope. And so we see, as we drift through this story, that the monuments we so often imagine, the pyramids, the statues, the golden treasures, were not the whole of Egypt. Beneath them was a people who worked, who suffered, who endured. Their hands, roughened and calloused, built a civilization that still captures our imagination. But those same hands also cradled children, kneaded bread, wove linen, and drew lines in the earth for planting. Theirs was not an easy life. It was, in many ways, brutally hard. Yet in its rhythm, in its persistence, there was something deeply human, something that connects us across the vastness of time. So let us continue walking slowly through this land, letting its textures settle gently around us. The golden sands, the flowing river, the cracked mud walls of a village, the taste of bread and beer, the sound of oxen in the fields. Life in ancient Egypt was unforgiving, but it was also vivid, real, and enduring. And in the calm of this story, we can begin to feel it not as a tale of pharaohs and kings, but as the quiet pulse of ordinary lives lived long ago. The rhythm of ancient Egypt unfolded not only in the villages but also in the fields, where the true pulse of survival beat most steadily. The Nile was the source of all life, and every year its waters rose and fell with a cycle so regular it became the anchor of existence. Yet this cycle was not without peril. Too little flooding, and crops withered; too much, and villages drowned beneath the water. For farmers, each season was a gamble, played against the whims of nature. At the peak of the inundation, the land lay hidden beneath a shallow inland sea. Fields disappeared, homes along the riverbank were sometimes abandoned, and families waited for the water to retreat. When it finally receded, it left behind a blanket of rich black silt, heavy with nutrients. This was the gift of the Nile, the very reason Egypt could thrive, where the desert on all sides promised only death. Farmers hurried to mark the land with cords and posts, measuring fields anew, for the waters had erased boundaries. Disputes were common, settled sometimes by local elders, sometimes by scribes, who kept records on papyrus scrolls. Into the moist soil, seeds were sown. Barley and wheat were staples, but flax, vegetables, and pulses filled the ground as well. Men and women labored together, their bodies bent in the sun. Oxen drew wooden plows across the earth, guided by hands calloused from years of toil. Children ran between the furrows, scattering seeds from baskets. The rhythm of life was echoed in the creak of leather harnesses, the lowing of animals, and the rhythmic slap of bare feet against the soil. But work in the fields was more than physical strain. It carried a weight of obligation. Much of what was grown did not remain with the farmers. A share was owed to the state, collected by officials on behalf of the pharaoh. Scribes, carrying their pallets of reed pens and ink, recorded harvests with meticulous care. Grain was measured, stored in great silos, and redistributed for workers, armies, and temples. For the peasant, this meant a life of near-constant labor with little reward. They ate, they survived, but luxury was far beyond their reach. This system bound the people tightly to the land, yet it also offered security of a kind. In years when the Nile's waters failed, famine loomed, crops withered, hunger spread, and suffering deepened. The wealthier could endure, but for the poor, scarcity was devastating. In such times, state granaries could provide relief, though never enough to ease all suffering. Hunger gnawed at the bones of countless Egyptians over the centuries, a quiet but persistent shadow over daily life. And yet, amidst this struggle, there was beauty. The fields, when in bloom, stretched green and golden beneath the vast blue sky. The Nile glimmered in the distance, dotted with the sails of boats. Palm trees swayed gently, offering pockets of shade. Farmers sang as they worked, voices rising in melodies that carried across the open air. Songs eased the weight of labor, turning endless hours into moments of shared humanity. At midday, the sun beat mercilessly. Workers rested briefly in the shadow of small huts or trees, eating bread and onions, sipping beer from clay jars. Conversation passed quietly, jokes were told, and children laughed. Then, as the shadows shortened, labor began again. For the Egyptian peasant, the body was a tool to be used until it could no longer endure. Pain in the muscles, in the joints, in the spine, these were constant companions. And yet, the work was done, day after day, season after season. As evening approached, animals were led back to pens. Tools were stored, fires lit, families gathered once more, weary but alive. The harshness of the day gave way to the gentle coolness of night. Across the land, the stars unveiled themselves, bright and clear. For Egyptians, the night sky was not only beautiful, it was sacred. The constellations were seen as gods and stories written above. Orion was linked to Osiris, eternal lord of the afterlife. The Milky Way was thought to be a heavenly river, mirroring the Nile. To look upward was to glimpse eternity. To believe that existence stretched far beyond the toil of the day. In wealthier households, life held different challenges. Scribes, officials, and craftsmen occupied a space above the peasants, yet below the nobility. They too lived in mud brick homes, though often larger and better furnished. Their walls might be painted, their floors swept clean, their diets richer with meat, honey, and fruit. They lived closer to towns, where markets bustled with trade. For them, education was possible. Boys might learn to read and write, memorizing lines of hieroglyphs, until they could record taxes, compose prayers, and copy texts. To be a scribe was a privilege, one that spared the body from endless fieldwork, but demanded endless hours of study. The reed pen was lighter than the plough, but it brought its own weariness. Hands cramped, eyes strained, backs bent over scrolls until muscles ached. And yet, in Egypt, literacy was a path to influence. Words carried power, and those who could record them shaped the workings of society. The dream of a poor family was often to send a son to the scribal schools, lifting him above the brutal cycle of labor. Few succeeded, but the hope lingered across generations. Even higher stood the artisans who built Egypt's wonders. Stonecutters, carpenters, metalworkers, painters, and masons lived in villages near royal projects. They carved temples, raised obelisks, decorated tombs. Their skill was revered, and their work endured for millennia. But their lives were no less harsh. Days began before dawn, filled with hammering, chiseling, lifting. The sun seared their skin, dust filled their lungs, stone splinters cut their hands. Injury was frequent, and relief was scarce. Still, the promise of rations, of security, of belonging to a group with shared purpose, kept them at their tasks. In Dire Elmad, a village of artisans who built tombs in the Valley of the Kings, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of both hardship and humanity. Workers left graffiti on walls, complaining of rations or celebrating friendships. They recorded sick days, disputes, and even the first known labor strike, when food supplies were delayed. Here, amid the dust of centuries, the voices of ordinary Egyptians still whisper, reminding us that their struggles were not so different from our own. Above them all stood the nobility, and the pharaoh himself. For them, life seemed gilded, surrounded by riches and servants. Their palaces were decorated with bright paints, their clothes fine, their meals abundant. Musicians played for their entertainment, dancers moved in graceful rhythm, perfumed oils scented the air. Yet even here, beneath the luxury, the brutal realities of Egypt still lingered. Illness did not spare the wealthy, and death visited palaces as surely as huts. The difference lay only in how comfortably life was lived before that inevitable end. The pharaoh, believed to be divine, bore a burden few could imagine. His role was to maintain the balance of order and harmony. Every flood, every famine, every invasion was seen as a reflection of his success or failure. He lived in grandeur, yes, but also under immense expectation. For ordinary people, the pharaoh was distant, a figure glimpsed only in statues, processions, or the sound of his decrees. Yet his presence shaped every life. Taxes were collected in his name, temples raised to honor his reign. Wars fought to expand his power. For the poor farmer, bent in the field, this distant ruler was at once protector and oppressor. The grain taken from his harvest built monuments he would never see. Yet those monuments, in some mysterious way, promised stability for all. The paradox of Egypt was that the suffering of many sustained the splendor of a few, and yet this order endured for centuries, shaping one of the longest-lasting civilizations the world has known. As the night deepens once again, let us pause in this reflection. Imagine yourself walking through a village after the day's labor has ended. The fires glow dimly, shadows dance on mud walls. A dog barks softly, then settles down. The Nile, always present, whispers nearby, its waters moving gently in the moonlight. In the distance, perhaps, the faint glow of a temple torch can be seen, reminding all who gaze that the gods are ever near. Here, in this moment, we feel the weight of their world. Brutal, yes, but also full of rhythm and meaning. A life carved by toil, shaped by faith, bound to the river, and illuminated by the stars. This was Egypt, not merely the land of pyramids and pharaohs, but the land of millions of ordinary souls who endured, who struggled, and who found beauty where they could. And so, as we continue deeper into this story, we carry with us their voices, their labors, their hopes. The sands of Egypt shift endlessly, yet the memory of those who walked them lingers still, whispering softly through the quiet night. Religion in ancient Egypt was not merely a matter of ritual. It was the air that people breathed, the quiet certainty behind every action, every hope, every fear. To the Egyptians, the world was alive with unseen forces. The Nile's rise was not only a natural cycle but the work of the god Hapi, pouring his blessings upon the land. The blazing sun that rose each morning was Ra, journeying across the sky in his golden bark. At night, when darkness fell, the same Ra descended into the underworld, battling serpents and forces of chaos, only to be reborn at dawn. For the people, daily life was steeped in this tapestry of gods. Amulets were worn around the neck, carved in shapes of scarabs or eyes, to shield against misfortune. Offerings of bread, beer, or incense were placed before small household shrines, meant to appease local spirits or honor a protective deity. A farmer might murmur a prayer before casting his seed into the soil. A mother might whisper to the goddess Tauret, protector of childbirth, as she brought new life into the world. Faith was woven through the simplest acts, transforming necessity into devotion. The temples of Egypt rose above the villages like mountains of stone, their pylons carved with hieroglyphs, their columns painted with vibrant color. For most Egyptians, entry into the innermost chambers was forbidden. Only priests and priestesses, purified through ritual washing, could approach the sacred statues. Ordinary people gathered outside, bringing offerings, listening to hymns, joining in festivals. The scent of incense drifted through the air. Drums echoed, voices chanted in unison. These gatherings were not only religious but social, moments when the harsh rhythm of labor gave way to shared celebration. Yet even religion bore its share of burden. The temples were not only houses of gods, but centers of wealth and power. Vast tracts of farmland belonged to them, worked by peasants whose labor enriched the priesthood. Taxes flowed toward them, offerings accumulated, and their influence stretched across the land. For the common man or woman, this meant yet another authority to whom they owed allegiance, yet another portion of their harvest claimed by forces beyond their control. Festivals, however, brought joy amid hardship. During the festival of Opet, great processions carried the sacred barks of the gods through the streets. Crowds gathered, cheering, clapping, singing as the images of Ammon, Mut, and Khonsu were paraded from Karnak to Luxor. For a time, the rigid divisions of society seemed to soften. The rich and poor alike watched the divine pass before them. Music filled the air, systems rattled, flutes played, drums kept time. Children laughed, men shouted in praise. Women sang hymns of devotion. Food and drink were shared during such times, a brief escape from the constant grind of survival. Beer flowed more freely, bread was baked in abundance, figs and dates sweetened the day. Stories were told, dances performed. For the weary peasant, these festivals were like sunlight breaking through a storm, moments of color in an otherwise gray world. The cycle of life, however, was never far from death. Egyptians accepted mortality with a pragmatism born of constant exposure. Life expectancy was short. Many died in childhood. Mothers risked death in childbirth. Disease spread easily. For the Egyptians, death was not an end, but a transition. To die was to enter the realm of Osiris, to be judged, and hopefully to live eternally in the field of reeds, a paradise where crops grew tall, water flowed freely, and toil was gentle rather than crushing. Funerary practices reflected this belief. Even the poorest tried to secure a proper burial, with some offering a simple clay pot of food, a few trinkets, or a scrap of linen. The wealthy, of course, prepared elaborate tombs filled with treasures, furniture, clothing, and spells painted on walls or written on papyrus. The famous Book of the Dead guided the soul through the dangers of the afterlife past crocodile-headed demons, serpent-filled lakes, and the great weighing of the heart. This weighing was central to Egyptian thought. The heart of the deceased was placed on scales, balanced against the feather of Mat, symbol of truth and justice. If the heart was heavier, burdened by lies and misdeeds, it was devoured by Amit, a terrifying beast, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile. The soul would then cease to exist. If the heart was lighter, the deceased was welcomed by Osiris and granted eternal life. The very idea shaped behavior. To live well was not only to survive in the here and now, but to prepare for what came after. Honesty, kindness, fairness, these were not abstract virtues, but practical necessities, for the afterlife depended on them. And so even amid brutality, Egyptians sought to live in harmony with Mat, to walk lightly in a world heavy with struggle. The brutality of life often revealed itself in health, or rather in the lack of it. Skeletal remains tell a silent story of bones worn down by labor, spines bent, teeth ground away by sand that crept into bread from stone mills. Arthritis, infections, broken bones all are found in the remains of ordinary Egyptians. Malnutrition left its mark too, for diets were heavy in bread and beer, but light in variety. The poor rarely tasted meat, rarely enjoyed fruit beyond what could be grown or traded locally. Diseases spread quickly in villages where people lived close to animals, where water carried parasites, where the heat bred insects. Flies swarmed constantly, buzzing over food, landing on eyes and mouths. Mosquitoes thrived near the river, spreading fevers. Worms infested the body, leaching strength. Medical texts from the time describe remedies, herbs, honey poultices, spells, but for many, healing came down to endurance. Some recovered, many did not. And yet, even here, in this realm of sickness and suffering, the Egyptians found ways to persevere. Healers applied honey to wounds, for it had natural antibacterial properties. Garlic and onions were believed to strengthen the body, and though their power was limited, they did provide nutrition. Prayers accompanied treatments, for healing was as much spiritual as physical. In temples, priests performed rituals to drive away illness, calling upon the gods to grant relief. For the patient, faith was often the greatest medicine, offering comfort when cures failed. Children grew up within this environment, learning early the rhythms of hardship. From a young age, they were set to tasks carrying water, gathering reeds, watching animals. Girls learned to grind grain, weave linen, tend fires. Boys learned to fish, plow, and repair tools. Play was not absent. Toys of wood, clay, and cloth have been found. Dolls, balls, little carved animals, all reminders that even amid difficulty, childhood still carried laughter. But the line between childhood and adulthood was short. By their teens, many were married, bearing the same responsibilities as their parents before them. Marriage itself was a practical affair, often unmarked by elaborate ceremony. A man and woman agreed to live together, families consented, and the union began. Love poems from Egypt suggest that affection did exist, that couples cherished each other. But the foundation of marriage was survival. A wife managed the household, bore children, tended to food. A husband worked fields or practiced his trade. Together they faced the brutal weight of life, sharing both labor and hope. Women in Egypt held a position unique among ancient societies. They could own property, inherit wealth, and even divorce their husbands if treated unjustly. Queens like Hatshepsut and Nefertiti rose to positions of power. Yet for the majority, daily life remained one of labor and endurance. Pregnancy was frequent, childbirth dangerous, tools were primitive, knowledge limited. Many women did not live beyond their childbearing years, and still, they carried on, ensuring the survival of families, weaving the thread of continuity through generations. Even joy was often tempered by risk. A festival might bring laughter, music, and food, but it also carried dangers of drunkenness, accidents, or brawls. A child's game might end with a broken bone, which could mean lifelong pain. A hunt along the river might provide fish or fowl, but could just as easily bring crocodiles from the depths. Life in Egypt was not a gentle current, but a constant balancing act between abundance and loss. And yet, as the sun rose and set, as the Nile flooded and receded, as seasons turned endlessly, the people endured. Their resilience was born of necessity, but it was also nurtured by a profound belief that their lives had meaning. Each harvest, each offering, each song was part of a larger order, a harmony that stretched beyond individual suffering. Brutality and beauty walked side by side, inseparable, shaping a civilization whose echoes remained thousands of years later. So as we drift deeper into this reflection, imagine the sound of the temple drums in the distance, the murmur of prayers, the flicker of torches casting shadows on painted walls. Imagine the fields stretching wide beneath the stars, the whisper of the river nearby, the laughter of children fading into the night. Within these images lies the heart of Egypt, a place where endurance and faith wove together, creating lives that were fragile yet unyielding, harsh yet filled with quiet grace. The sun climbs once more over the horizon, a great disk of gold that floods the land with brilliance. Its light falls upon every field, every village, every stretch of desert, and upon the great monuments rising from the sands. These monuments, though built by command of kings, were crafted by the hands of ordinary people, hands calloused and worn, hands that carried stone, shaped mud, and bent beneath the weight of endless labor. Work was the very heartbeat of life in Egypt. Each person, from the humblest farmer to the skilled artisan, contributed in some way to the fabric of the state. For most, this work meant the soil plowing, sowing, tending, and harvesting. But others found their place in crafts, in weaving, in carpentry, in the quiet, meticulous shaping of raw materials into tools, jewelry, furniture, or vessels. Artisans lived in their own quarters, sometimes in communities provided by the state, as in the village of Deir el-Medina. There, workers who carved and painted the tombs of pharaohs had modest homes, small courtyards, narrow streets. Their lives were not free of hardship, but they enjoyed some privileges: regular rations of grain, beer, and oil provided by the authorities. Yet, even in these conditions, labor was grueling. The tomb walls, adorned with brilliant colors, tell stories of gods and kings, but behind them was the strain of men who worked in flickering torchlight, hunched for hours, chiseling stone with steady precision. Stone itself carried its own weight of brutality. Quarries lay open in the desert, where blocks were cut under the scorching sun. Men hauled them on sledges, dragging massive loads across sand. Water poured ahead to reduce friction. The rhythm of ropes creaking, feet pressing, voices chanting in unison echoed across the landscape. To modern eyes, it seems impossible, and yet it was done slowly, painfully, with determination, and countless lives given to the task. For those working with their hands, the body bore the memory of labor. Backs bent, joints swelled, muscles ached. There was no relief beyond brief pauses in the shade, a drink of beer, or the cool embrace of night. And yet, their work shaped Egypt itself, its temples, its statues, its palaces. Their suffering became the foundation of splendor. Above all loomed the figure of the pharaoh, the living god upon earth. To the people, he was not merely a ruler but a divine presence, the embodiment of Horus, protector of Mat, keeper of balance. His commands carried the weight of eternity. Yet for the ordinary Egyptian, the pharaoh was both distant and ever-present. Distant, because most would never see him, his palace hidden behind walls of stone. Present, because his decrees touched every life. Taxes collected, labor demanded, monuments raised. Taxes were a burden that fell upon every household. Grain, livestock, linen, all were counted, recorded by scribes, collected by officials. To resist was unthinkable. The authority of the state was unyielding. Villagers sometimes faced audits, inspectors arriving to measure harvests, to ensure nothing was withheld. For the farmer, this meant that even in years of poor flood, when grain was scarce, the obligation remained. Hunger could visit families while storehouses filled with offerings to the temples and the state. Scribes were the keepers of this system, wielding power through ink and papyrus. To be a scribe was a privilege, a life free from heavy labor, but it demanded years of training. Boys from wealthier families learned to copy hieroglyphs, to calculate, to compose letters. With their skills, they became indispensable. The records they kept ensured the machinery of Egypt moved without pause. To be a scribe was to hold knowledge, and knowledge was a shield against the brutality endured by so many others. The army too played its role. Soldiers were drawn from the common people, trained to wield spears, bows and shields. They marched in the heat, slept on rough ground, and fought in distant lands for the glory of their pharaoh. Some gained honor, even wealth, but for most, it was another life of toil, another demand of the state. To refuse was to risk punishment. To serve was to endure hardship. Brutality lay not always in violence, but in the relentless demands of survival and duty. Each Egyptian bore the weight of obligations, family, community, gods, and king. To falter meant shame, poverty, or worse. And yet, through it all, there remained resilience, a quiet persistence that carried life forward. Imagine, now, the sound of chisels striking stone in the Valley of the Kings. The echo bounces from wall to wall, mingling with murmured conversations, the shuffling of feet, the hiss of breath as men work in torchlit chambers. Above, the desert is silent, wind brushing across empty hills. Below, deep in the earth, images of gods and kings take form. Blue, red, yellow, green pigments made from crushed minerals brighten the walls, glowing in the flickering light. The work is exhausting, the air thick with dust, but there is pride too. These men know they are crafting the eternal resting places of pharaohs, sanctuaries meant to last forever. Outside the tombs, in the villages, life carries its quieter rhythms. Women pound grain into flour, children chase each other in dusty streets. Old men sit in the shade, telling stories of gods and ancestors. The river glitters in the distance, the source of all that sustains them. Boats drift lazily, sails catching the breeze, transporting goods, people, and news from far-off places dot in the markets. The air is filled with voices, buyers and sellers haggling over fish, dates, pottery, cloth. The smell of dried fish mingles with the sweetness of honey, the tang of onions, the earthy scent of beer. Cats weave between stalls, sleek and watchful, chasing rats and stealing scraps. Donkeys bray as they carry baskets piled high with goods. Flies buzz persistently, landing on everything, reminding all of the constant presence of decay and discomfort. Yet even here, amid dust and noise, there is color and life. Brightly dyed linens, polished faience beads, jars of fragrant oils, painted amulets, all small tokens of beauty that soften the edges of harsh existence. To own even a little ornament, to wear a string of beads or a ring carved from bone, was to carry dignity in a world that often stripped it away. The pharaoh's image watched over these markets, carved into stone, steely, painted on walls, invoked in proclamations. His power was absolute, but it was also fragile. Behind the grandeur, kings rose and fell, dynasties shifted, palaces crumbled, civil wars erupted, invasions came, famines threatened the stability of the land. The people, though, endured. Pharaohs might change, temples might fall into ruin, but the Nile continued its eternal cycle, and so too did the lives of those who depended on it. At night, in palaces lit by oil lamps, feasts took place. Nobles reclined on carved chairs, servants bringing platters of roasted duck, beef, and sweet pastries flavored with honey. Harpists played gentle music, dancers moved with grace, perfumes filled the air. Beyond the palace walls, in the villages, families ate their bread and beer by the glow of a single flame, their meal plain but sufficient. The contrast was vast, but it was accepted. Hierarchy was the structure of the world, and to question it was to question Mat itself. The gods, the king, the land, all were bound together. To disrupt one was to disrupt all. This belief held society in place, sustaining order even when brutality pressed down upon the people. It was a system both fragile and unyielding, where survival demanded acceptance, endurance, and faith. As the night deepens, stars emerge once more over Egypt. They shine with a brilliance that seems eternal, guiding both farmer and pharaoh alike. The river flows quietly, reflecting their light, carrying whispers of lives lived long ago, lives of labor, of devotion, of suffering, and of resilience. Brutal, yes, but also enduring, marked by moments of beauty that continue to echo in the stillness of history. As the days of Egypt unfolded, one after another in their steady rhythm, life was shaped not only by labor and kingship, but also by the intimate bonds of family and community. Every village was a world of its own, with households clustered close, walls of mud brick warmed by the sun. Families lived simply, yet each detail of their existence reflected both hardship and resilience. A house might be little more than 2 or 3 rooms, built with a flat roof of reeds and plaster, shaded against the glare of the sky. The walls kept out the desert winds, though heat lingered inside. Within these rooms, families gathered, ate, and rested. Mats were laid out on the ground for sleeping, pots lined the shelves for cooking, and jars of water stood ready to quench thirst after long hours in the fields. Children brought laughter to these spaces, though even their lives were touched by the harshness of the world around them. From an early age, they learned the skills of their parents. Boys followed their fathers to the fields, watching as seeds were pressed into wet soil, as cattle pulled the plow. Girls stayed close to their mothers, learning to grind grain, to weave, to care for younger siblings. Play existed, of course, wooden toys, dolls carved from clay, balls made of leather, yet games were often woven into tasks, a way of preparing for the demands that adulthood would bring all too soon. Illness hovered constantly over childhood. Fevers, coughs, infections, all could take young lives quickly, without warning. The warmth of the Nile brought fertility, but also disease. Mosquitoes bred in still waters, carrying sickness, while contaminated food or poor sanitation spread ailments through households. For parents, the joy of children was accompanied by fear, the knowledge that survival was never guaranteed. And yet, families cherished each other with a devotion that softened the edges of their burdens. Mothers sang lullabies while rocking infants to sleep. Fathers told stories by firelight, tales of gods and ancestors, shaping the beliefs of the young. Grandparents shared wisdom drawn from long years, their words blending with the hum of crickets outside. Even in the most difficult times, there was comfort in these small, spittering bonds. Marriage formed the foundation of family life. Though it was less formal than one might imagine, ceremonies were simple, often marked by the act of moving in together and beginning a shared household. Love could grow, though sometimes unions were practical alliances between families, arrangements shaped by need. Women bore great responsibilities, managing homes, preparing food, raising children, and often working alongside men in fields or markets. Though the law placed them below men, women held rights unusual for their time. They could own property, inherit wealth, and even initiate divorce if necessary. Still, survival required harmony, and households often contained extended families living under one roof. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, many contributed to the daily rhythm, ensuring that tasks were shared and that support was available when hardship struck. Beyond family, religion wove every life into a larger tapestry. Each act, each duty, was infused with spiritual meaning. The gods were present in every corner of existence: Ra in the blazing sun, Osiris in the fertile earth, Hathor in music and love, Anubis in the quiet of the tomb. To live rightly was to maintain balance with these forces, to honor them with offerings, to speak their names, to remember that life was only one stage of a longer journey. Death, when it came, was not seen as an ending, but a transition. The care given to burial reflected this belief. Even the poorest families, who could not afford elaborate tombs, still placed their loved ones in the earth, with token spots of food, small amulets, perhaps a favorite tool or piece of jewelry. These offerings were meant to sustain the soul in the afterlife, to ease the passage into the next world. The rituals of death could be as simple as a few prayers, or as grand as the long ceremonies of the elite. The wealthy prepared elaborate tombs, filled with goods, furniture, statues, and painted walls that spoke of eternal feasts and gardens. The famous mummification process was reserved for those who could afford it. Priests performed the rites with solemn chants, carefully preserving the body so that the soul might recognize it in eternity. For most Egyptians, death was a reminder of life's fragility. Every day held the potential for loss, whether through illness, accident, or the failure of the Nile's flood. But belief in the afterlife provided comfort, a sense that suffering was not the final word. To endure hardship now was to prepare for a more balanced, more peaceful existence beyond. Still, life itself demanded unyielding strength. Each season brought its own tasks, its own challenges. When the Nile flooded, men and women worked tirelessly to repair dikes, to redirect waters, to prepare the soil. When the flood receded, they planted quickly, racing against time. In the growing season, fields required tending, weeds pulled, pests chased away, water channels maintained. At harvest, the air was filled with the sound of sickles slicing through stalks, of bundles tied and carried, of threshing floors alive with motion. Even the tools of labor told stories of endurance. Wooden plows, stone sickles, simple baskets all required effort far beyond what we might imagine today. The absence of iron or modern machinery meant every task consumed the body's strength. The work was endless, repetitive, and often painful. Yet without it, there was no survival. Festivals provided brief relief, moments when the burdens of labor were set aside. Villagers gathered to honor gods, to share food and drink, to sing and dance. Music filled the air, harps, flutes, drums, keeping rhythm as people moved together. Stories were told of ancient battles, of gods who triumphed, of kings who restored order. Laughter mingled with song, and for a time, life felt lighter, less brutal. But when the festival ended, duties returned, taxes awaited, harvests demanded, obligations pressed down once more. The rhythm resumed, as steady as the Nile's flow. Imagine again the daily scene, a farmer rising before dawn, his body stiff from yesterday's labor. He steps outside his modest home, the air cool, stars fading in the west. He shoulders a wooden tool, calls softly to his oxen, and walks toward the fields. His wife prepares bread for the morning, grinding grain on a stone, her hands moving with practiced rhythm. Children stir, stretching, rubbing sleep from their eyes, ready to follow the pattern of their parents' lives. This was Egypt, not only the temples and pyramids, but the countless small moments of toil, devotion, and survival. Brutal, yes, in the demands it placed upon every soul, but also steady, enduring, shaped by faith that each day, no matter how hard, brought them closer to balance with the eternal dot at night. Families gathered once more, sharing bread, beer, and stories. The flicker of an oil lamp lit their faces as they spoke of ancestors, of gods, of hopes for the future. The children listened, their eyes heavy with sleep, their dreams filled with images of golden fields, flowing rivers, and the distant gaze of stars. The night deepened, cool winds brushing across the desert, carrying the faint sounds of animals, of insects, of water lapping at the banks of the river. Above, the heavens stretched endlessly, constellations forming patterns the Egyptians knew well. They read the stars as guides, as signs, as reminders that the order of the universe extended far beyond the limits of their lives. And so the people endured, through hardship and beauty, through toil and rest, through suffering and faith. They carried the weight of their world with resilience. It was not an easy life, nor a gentle one, but it was theirs, a life bound to the river, to the gods, to the eternal rhythm of a land where survival itself was both brutal and sacred. Medicine in ancient Egypt was as much spiritual as it was practical. To the people of the Nile, illness was not just a matter of the body, it was also a disruption in harmony, a breaking of balance between human beings, the gods, and unseen forces. Priests and healers stood at the center of this understanding, weaving together ritual, prayer, and practical remedies. The knowledge they carried was surprisingly advanced. From the scrolls we now call the medical papyri, we glimpsed the remedies Egyptians trusted: honey for wounds, thought to ward off infection; willow bark, crushed and mixed with water, to ease pain, an early form of what we know today as aspirin. They used garlic and onions to boost strength, castor oil for digestive troubles, and herbs for fever. Yet alongside these treatments were incantations, prayers whispered as hands pressed herbs to skin, as ointments were applied. Illness was believed to arise from malevolent spirits as often as from natural causes, and so a healer's task was both to restore the body and to expel the unseen forces that lingered in shadows. A cure was not complete unless balance was restored to both flesh and soul. Despite this knowledge, sickness was a constant companion. Eye diseases were common, caused by sand, dust, and parasites carried by water. Infection spread easily in crowded households. Accidents from labor left wounds that could fester. The Nile's blessing also carried curse, for parasites thrived in its waters, weakening bodies over time. For the poor especially, the limits of medicine meant lives often ended early. Despite all efforts to prolong them, still, there was resilience in how Egyptians approached health. They endured discomfort with quiet strength, trusting that if not healed here, the soul would find restoration in the afterlife. The suffering of the body was not the whole of existence, it was only a stage in a longer eternal journey. Food, too, reflected this blend of hardship and sustenance. The diet of ordinary Egyptians was humble, shaped by what the Nile's fields could provide. Bread and beer formed the daily foundation, consumed in nearly every meal. The bread was dense, often gritty with bits of sand from the grinding stones, which wore down teeth over time. Beer, thick and nutritious, was more like a porridge than the drink we know today, providing both calories and hydration. Alongside these staples came vegetable zines, leeks, garlic, lentils, chickpeas, cucumbers and melons appeared in the hot months, refreshing against the desert heat. Dates and figs sweetened meals, while honey was a treasured delicacy when it could be found. Meat was rarer for common people, often reserved for festivals or special occasions. Fish from the Nile, poultry from household yards, and occasional cuts of goat or sheep filled tables when fortune allowed. Yet famine always loomed as a threat. A poor flood could mean hunger for entire villages, for without the Nile's water, crops withered. Grain stores became precious, carefully measured, guarded against theft. Families learned to stretch what little they had, turning scraps into soups, stretching flour into coarse bread. To go hungry was to live with weakness, and still the fields demanded labor. Even in this, Egyptians found beauty. They flavored bread with herbs, mixed beer with fruit, dried figs and dates for preservation. At feasts, they roasted meat, poured wine, and shared dishes of stews and pastries. The wealthy dined on delicacies, but even the poor found joy in simple meals when shared with family. Eating was not only survival, it was an affirmation that life continued. Despite hardship, beyond food and medicine, another harsh truth defined life in Egypt: the shadow of war. Though the Nile Valley was sheltered by deserts on either side, invaders and rival kingdoms always threatened. Armies marched across sands, clashed along borders, and sometimes reached the heart of Egypt itself. For common people, war meant conscription. Farmers were called from their fields, placed into ranks, handed spears, bows, or simple clubs. Training was often minimal, yet expectations were high. They marched long distances, carried supplies, and faced enemies under the hot sun. Wounds were frequent, deaths inevitable. Families left behind worried not only for their loved ones, but also for the harvests that went untended while men were away. The elite soldiers, that professional warriors, lived differently, trained with skill, equipped with chariots, bronze weapons, shields of leather and wood. They carried prestige, but also bore risk. A battle could shift suddenly, a chariot overturned, an arrow loosed from a distant bow. Warfare was a gamble, and each life carried into combat was fragile against its violence. Yet for the people of Egypt, the king's command was not questioned. Pharaoh was not merely a ruler but a divine presence, believed to embody the gods on earth. To fight for him was to fight for the preservation of order, for the continuation of the sacred balance of the world. And so, men marched into danger, carrying with them both fear and devotion. Still, most lives were lived away from battlefields. The true struggles were quieter, bound to the demands of each day. A farmer breaking hardened ground with a wooden plow, a woman grinding grain into flour, her back aching from endless repetition, a child carrying jars of water from the river, the weight straining small arms. These were battles of endurance, won not by weapons but by persistence. The body bore the marks of this constant effort. Bones show signs of arthritis, teeth worn down to stubs, injuries healed poorly. Yet alongside this suffering, there was resilience. People adapted, finding ways to continue even when pain lingered. Families supported one another, neighbors lent hands, and the community carried burdens together. Spiritual life offered strength as well. In temples, priests tended statues of gods, offering food and incense as though the divine walked among them. In households, small shrines held clay figures, where families whispered prayers for health, for safety, for good harvests. Music softened labor, stories eased evenings, laughter lightened sorrow. Brutality was real, but so was endurance. At night, when the air cooled and the desert winds stirred, life slowed. Oil lamps flickered in dark rooms, shadows dancing along walls. Families gathered close, sharing bread, sipping beer, telling stories of gods and ancestors. The stars above stretched endlessly, constellations traced with fingers, their patterns guiding farmers and dreamers alike. To live in Egypt was to accept both harshness and beauty, to endure the weight of survival while never losing sight of eternity. Each day was a struggle, but also a thread in the great tapestry of existence, woven with faith, with family, with hope that even in suffering, life carried meaning. The Nile flowed on, season after season, carrying with it both blessing and burden, and the people, bound to its rhythm, endured with patience, with resilience, with a quiet strength that echoed through the centuries. The rhythm of Egyptian life, though filled with struggle, also allowed for moments of release. The people of the Nile, after long months of toil in fields or workshops, turned to festivals, music, and simple pleasures to ease the burdens of survival. These gatherings, scattered throughout the year, gave them time to breathe, to laugh, and to reconnect with their neighbors and their gods. Festivals were not occasional luxuries, but integral threads in the calendar of Egyptian existence. Each month was marked by one celebration or another, dedicated to a deity, the cycle of the Nile, or the turning of the seasons. Even for those who labored hardest, these days carried weight. They offered an interruption in routine, a pause from endless toil, a chance to experience joy in the midst of hardship. Imagine the sound of a festival beginning. Drums echo across narrow streets, reed flutes trill in the hands of musicians, their melodies rising above chatter and laughter. Dancers whirl with bright linen dresses, their bracelets jingling. Torches flare as dusk settles, the air scented with roasted fish, grilled geese, fresh bread, and sweet dates passed from one hand to another. Children run between legs, their laughter sharp and unburdened. Old men lean on staffs, watching with a mix of weariness and delight. Some festivals were deeply religious, tied to gods who governed the cycles of life. The festival of Opet, for example, brought people of Thebes together to celebrate the god Amen, his consort Mut, and their son Cons. The statue of Ammon would be carried from his great temple at Karnak to Luxor temple, borne on a ceremonial bark. Crowds thronged the streets, waiting to catch a glimpse, hoping for blessings. Priests sang hymns, incense drifted, and commoners felt themselves part of a divine procession. For the weary, the event was not only spiritual, it was a reminder that the gods had not abandoned them. That order still held sway in a world of difficulty. Other festivals carried lighter tones. The festival of drunkenness, dedicated to the goddess Hathor, filled cities with wine, song, and dance. People let go of restraint, celebrating abundance, joy, and vitality. For those who rarely tasted luxury, the day provided rare indulgence, a chance to laugh too loudly, to eat until full, to forget for a brief span the weariness of work and hunger. Even in humble villages, smaller gatherings marked the turning of seasons. When the Nile's flood receded, leaving fertile mud across the fields, people gave thanks. Families offered prayers, shared modest meals, and sang songs of gratitude for the river's generosity. These gatherings stitched communities together, strengthening bonds that were otherwise tested by scarcity. Music carried a central place in these moments. Simple instruments, drums, clappers, flutes, harps created rhythms that echoed through courtyards and along riverbanks. The harp, with its long curved neck, produced gentle melodies that soothed weary minds. The sistrum, a rattle sacred to Hathor, clattered in time with dance. Music was not simply entertainment, it was a way to connect with the divine, to stir emotions, to give voice to joys and sorrows alike. Art, too, brightened daily existence. On the walls of homes, simple decorations of lotus flowers, fish, or birds reminded families of beauty in the world around them. In temples and tombs, more elaborate works told stories of gods, kings, and eternity. To walk past painted walls was to be reminded that life, no matter how difficult, was part of something larger, something eternal. For artisans, creation was both livelihood and devotion. Stone carvers shaped statues of gods with careful patience, their hands calloused from years of labor. Painters ground pigments from ochre and malachite, mixing them into vivid colors that endured for millennia. Weavers twisted flax into linen, making garments that caught the desert wind. Each act of creation carried dignity, even when the pay was meager. Storytelling filled evenings after work. Families gathered under flickering oil lamps, telling tales of God's adventures, of wise kings, of animals who spoke with human voices. Stories softened the silence of night, allowing imagination to flourish where reality was harsh. Children drifted into dreams as words painted pictures of distant lands, of heroic deeds, of the afterlife's promise. But even amid these joys, brutality lingered. The very festivals that lifted spirits demanded labor to prepare fields, worked harder in advance. Food hoarded for weeks, families saving every scrap for one day of abundance. Musicians, dancers, and priests, though celebrated, relied on the support of workers who shouldered the burdens behind the scenes. A festival ended, and by morning the routine returned: fields to till, bread to bake, water to carry. Joy was fleeting, survival constant. For the poor, celebrations sometimes sharpened awareness of inequality. They watched the wealthy dine on roasted meats, drink imported wine, and wear jeweled collars, while they themselves had little more than coarse bread and beer. Yet still they participated, for in the collective energy of celebration, all felt lifted, if only for a moment, beyond the weariness of their station. In quieter ways, the Egyptians created their own leisure. Fishing along the Nile offered both food and calm, a chance to sit by the water's edge, casting lines into gentle ripples. Board games like Sanat, played with carved pieces on wooden boards, provided both entertainment and spiritual meaning. To move the tokens was to mirror the soul's journey through the afterlife, a reminder that every game was also a prayer for safe passage. Children found joy in simple toys, clay animals, bowls made of papyrus, carved dolls. Their laughter rang through narrow alleys, brightening even the most crowded of neighborhoods. Though they too would one day bear the weight of labor, their innocence gave families comfort, a reminder that life continued despite hardship. As the sun sank each day and shadows stretched across mud-brick walls, small communities gathered for songs, dances, or shared meals. Flames of oil lamps swayed in the breeze, carrying the smell of smoke and roasted fish. The air cooled, and voices carried across courtyards, weaving together into a tapestry of human connection. These nights were brief, but they mattered. They gave people strength to face the rising sun and the long work ahead. Through festivals, art, music, and play, Egyptians carved out spaces of resilience. They acknowledged the brutality of life, the hunger, the illness, the endless toil, but refused to let hardship define them entirely. In laughter, in song, in the swirl of dancers' robes, they declared their humanity. They insisted that beauty, no matter how fleeting, could exist even in the harshest desert. And as the Nile flowed, as stars spread across the sky, in patterns both familiar and eternal, these moments of joy shimmered like reflections on water. They could not erase the difficulties of survival, but they softened them, reminding each soul that life, though brutal, was also luminous. The people of Egypt lived within this balance, between hardship and celebration, between toil and release, between sorrow and joy. To endure was to bend without breaking, to accept pain without surrendering to it, to keep singing even when the night seemed endless. Death was never far from the thoughts of the ancient Egyptians. In a land where life was often short, where illness struck without warning, and where accidents or famine could cut existence short, the awareness of mortality ran deep. Yet unlike many cultures, the Egyptians did not see death as an end. To them, it was a passage, a doorway to another existence, one that had to be carefully prepared for. From the humblest villager to the greatest pharaoh, life was shaped by the belief that eternity awaited beyond the grave. The afterlife was not imagined as a vague place of shadows. It was thought of as a continuation of life itself, a perfected version of Egypt, where fields were green, waters flowed abundantly, and toil was eased. But entry into this paradise was not automatic. It required preparation, devotion, and above all, careful provision for the journey. For the wealthy, this meant tombs of stone, stocked with goods, guarded by statues, and decorated with paintings meant to guide the soul. For the poor, it might mean little more than a simple pit in the sand, covered with whatever the family could spare. Yet even then, small offerings, bread, beer, or a clay figure, were placed by the body, tokens of hope that the soul would find nourishment on its path. The body itself held special importance. Egyptians believed that the soul was tied to the physical form. To survive in the afterlife, the body had to be preserved. This belief gave rise to the practice of mummification, a process that, over centuries, grew into a complex art. In its earliest forms, natural preservation occurred when bodies were buried in the dry desert sands. The heat and dryness prevented decay, leaving the body recognizable long after death. Over time, priests developed deliberate techniques to replicate this preservation. Organs were carefully removed, dried, and placed in canopec jars guarded by the 4 sons of Horus. The body was treated with natron salts, dried for weeks, then wrapped in linen, layer after layer, each fold accompanied by prayers and amulets for protection, for those who could afford it. The process was elaborate and costly. The best linen, the purest resins, the most skillful embalmers all ensured that the deceased would be whole and safeguarded in the afterlife. But, for the poor, burial was simpler. Many could not afford full mummification, relying instead on shallow graves, where the desert's natural dryness did what it could. The contrast between rich and poor extended beyond life, into eternity itself. Yet, preparing for death was not only about the body, it was also about the tomb. For centuries, Egyptians built resting places that were more than graves, they were eternal homes. The earliest rulers built mastabas, flat-roofed stone structures above burial chambers. Later came the pyramids, massive monuments rising from the desert, proclaiming the power of kings who sought immortality. These pyramids were not only tombs but cosmic symbols, their shapes echoing the rays of the sun, pointing the soul heavenward. But even beyond kings, tombs mattered deeply to ordinary Egyptians. In the city of Deir el-Medina, a village of artisans and builders, families labored for generations to create tombs for the Valley of the Kings. These workers painted walls with delicate scenes of gods, stars, and fields of abundance. They carved chambers deep into rock, ensuring that kings and nobles would be guarded through eternity. Yet their own tombs, though smaller, showed the same devotion, scenes of families sharing meals, of musicians playing, of loved ones embraced, reminders of life's most precious moments. The artistry of tomb decoration carried profound meaning. Scenes were not chosen at random. Each image served as a guide, a charm, or a prayer. Gods such as Osiris, Anubis, and Ra appeared to lead the soul through the trials of the underworld. Spells from the Book of the Dead were inscribed, their words like maps for a soul navigating darkness. Even the colors held significance: green for rebirth, blue for water and the heavens, gold for the sun's eternal power. For common people, who could not afford elaborate tombs, small Shabti figures offered comfort. These little statues, often made of clay or wood, were meant to come alive in the afterlife, performing labor in place of the deceased. Even those who had toiled endlessly in life hoped to rest in eternity, letting their Shabtis do the work. Still, death was not gentle. Illnesses often struck without mercy. Mothers lost children to fevers, fathers collapsed from exhaustion, families buried their loved ones in the sandy earth. Grief weighed heavy. Yet, the rituals of burial gave people strength. They could not control life's hardships, but they could prepare for death. In doing so, they gave order to sorrow, transforming loss into a journey with meaning. The funerary procession was one of the most moving spectacles of Egyptian life. The body, wrapped and adorned, was carried on a bier through streets, accompanied by mourners. Women wailed and sang laments, their cries both sorrowful and ritual. Priests burned incense, chanted prayers, and poured libations. At the tomb, ceremonies such as the opening of the mouth were performed. This sacred rite was believed to restore the deceased's senses, allowing them to breathe, see, speak, and eat in the afterlife. It was a solemn moment, one filled with both grief and hope. As the tomb was sealed, families placed food, drink, and keepsakes beside the body. They spoke final words of love and farewell. They stepped back, leaving their loved one to eternity, trusting that the gods would guide them onward. For those who labored to create tombs, death itself was a familiar companion. In the Valley of the Kings, workers carved through unforgiving stone by torchlight, their lungs filled with dust, their bodies aching from hammer and chisel. They carried on, knowing their efforts would outlast them. Many of their names are lost, yet their handiwork remains, etched into walls that still gleam with color after thousands of years. The burden of preparing for death weighed not only on individuals but on entire families. Saving for burial began long before life's end. Families stored linen, set aside jars, and built tombs in advance. To die without preparation was a fate dreaded by all, for it meant wandering in the afterlife, hungry, lost, and forgotten. This anxiety shaped even daily habits. People whispered prayers to the gods, made small offerings at shrines, and sought favor through acts of devotion. A loaf of bread given to a neighbor, a libation poured for the dead, a song sung in a temple, all were believed to strengthen one's place in eternity. And yet, despite all this preparation, the outcome was never certain. In the afterlife, the soul faced judgment. It stood before Osiris and the divine tribunal. Its heart weighed against the feather of Mat, the principle of truth and justice. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul passed into paradise. If heavier, it was devoured by Ammit, the fearsome creature part, crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus. This belief lent gravity to every choice in life. To live justly, to act with kindness, to respect order. These were not only virtues, but necessities. A cruel act, a selfish word, an unjust deed could tip the scales. Every Egyptian, no matter their station, carried this weight. In this way, death was both a terror and a comfort. It was the end of suffering for some, the promise of renewal for others, the ultimate test of all. To prepare for it was to accept life's brevity and to hope for eternity's embrace. As the Nile flowed endlessly, as stars turned above desert sands, the Egyptians walked daily between two worlds, the world of struggle and the world of eternity. Their tombs, their rituals, their prayers, all were bridges across that divide. Life was brutal, but death held the possibility of peace. And so, families mourned and prepared, priests prayed, embalmers worked, and builders carved. Each act was an offering to eternity, a refusal to let life's harshness end in nothingness. The brutality of existence was answered by the beauty of belief, by the dream of fields of reeds, by the hope that after labor came rest. Life in ancient Egypt may appear golden when seen through the gleam of temples, pyramids, and the treasures of kings, yet beneath the splendor lay the hands of countless men and women who toiled each day to sustain the kingdom. Their sweat built the monuments, their labor fed the people, their sacrifices defended the land. Without them, Egypt's glory could not have existed. But for these people, life was often a chain of burdens, heavy and unending. The farmer, more than any other, lived closest to both the blessings and the cruelties of the Nile. Each year, the river's flooding gave life to the land. Black silt settled over fields, renewing the soil and promising harvests. But with this gift came dependence. If the floodwaters rose too high, they swallowed villages, washing away homes and fields. If they fell too low, drought followed, and hunger crept into every household. The farmer's fate was bound tightly to a force he could not control. From dawn to dusk, the farmer labored in the heat of the sun. He guided oxen to plow the fertile earth, cast seeds into furrows, and prayed for the right balance of water and warmth. Later, when harvest came, he bent his back to cut grain with sickles of wood and flint, binding sheaves by hand. The work was relentless, his body weary, yet it was never quite enough, for much of the harvest went to temples and to the state as tax. What remained for his family was modest, just enough to endure until the next season. Alongside him, his wife worked no less. She ground grain into flour using heavy stones, her hands blistered and sore from the effort. Hour after hour she knelt, rhythmically crushing kernels into meal to bake into bread. Bread and beer were the staples of life, and her labor kept her family alive. She fetched water, tended to animals, wove linen, and cared for children. Her tasks were many, her rest rare. Children too were drawn into work at an early age. A boy might help in the fields, learning to drive cattle or mend irrigation ditches. A girl might assist her mother, grinding flour or spinning thread. Play existed, but always in the shadow of responsibility. To live in ancient Egypt meant to work, to contribute, to endure. Beyond the fields lay the labor of craftsmen. Carpenters shaped wood into tools, chests, and boats. Stonecutters carved blocks for temples and tombs, their hands roughened by chisel and hammer. Potters shaped clay into jars for storing grain and beer. Metalworkers forged copper into tools and ornaments, sparks flying as they hammered against anvils. Each craft carried its skill, its rhythm, its hardships. Perhaps the most demanding labor of all was that of the builders. To raise the monuments of Egypt required thousands of hands, working in rhythm, often under punishing conditions. Workers cut stone from distant quarries, dragging blocks across sand on wooden sledges, wetting the ground to reduce friction. Teams hauled them with ropes, straining together, their voices chanting in unison to keep time. Ramps of mud, brick and rubble rose beside monuments, allowing blocks to be dragged upward. The work consumed years, even lifetimes. Though often imagined as slaves, most of these laborers were not. Many were conscripted peasants, called upon to serve the state for part of the year, a duty owed in place of taxes. They were fed and housed while they worked, but the labor was grueling. Injuries were common, exhaustion constant. Relief came only when the season's service ended, allowing them to return to their fields and families. Life for soldiers was equally burdensome, though in different ways. Egypt was not always at war, but when campaigns arose, peasants and workers alike could be drawn into the army. They marched across deserts under a scorching sun, carrying spears, shields, and meager rations. Battles were fought with chariots, bows, and axes, the clash of armies echoing across plains. For those who survived, rewards might come: land, wealth, or honor. But for most, soldiering meant hardship and risk, another demand of service to the state. Even in times of peace, soldiers guarded Egypt's borders, patrolling the desert edges, watching for raiders or rival kingdoms. They stood in garrisons, far from their homes, their lives bound to discipline and duty. Some found pride in this service, others longed only to return to their villages. For all workers, whether farmers, craftsmen, or soldiers, the state was an ever-present weight. Taxes were collected in grain, livestock, and labor. Scribes, those literate officials who recorded the kingdom's business, walked through villages tallying harvests and goods. To underpay was to risk punishment. To resist was unthinkable. The farmer bent his back, not only for his family, but for the temple and the crown. Still, amid these hardships, small joys existed. Families gathered in the evening to share meals, tell stories, and sing songs. Children laughed and played along the banks of the Nile. Festivals brought moments of respite, when music, feasting, and dance lifted weary spirits. These moments, though brief, gave light to otherwise demanding lives. But the demands never disappeared. For many, survival was a narrow path, threatened by flood, famine, or the needs of the state. Illness struck often, medicine was limited, and injuries from labor could linger painfully. To endure was itself a triumph, and yet the people carried on. Generation after generation, they sowed, harvested, built, and served. Their hands raised the pyramids, their sweat fed the kingdom, their sacrifices sustained the grandeur of Egypt. They left behind little in the way of treasure or glory, but without them, there would have been no Egypt at all. The kings are remembered, their tombs shining with gold. The temples still stand, their columns tall against the desert sky. But behind these wonders were countless unnamed lives: farmers who rose before dawn, women who ground grain until their hands ached, builders who strained against ropes, soldiers who marched across sands. It was their daily burden that bore the weight of a civilization. And as we reflect on their struggles, we begin to see that the story of Egypt was not only about gods and kings, but about ordinary people who lived, toiled, and endured. Life for them was brutal, yet also resilient, filled with quiet courage and unrecorded strength. In ancient Egypt, survival was often a test of endurance, but within the hardships of labor and the demands of the state, people carved out lives of rhythm and routine, where family ties, modest meals, and daily rituals offered a sense of comfort. To understand the brutality of life is also to notice the quiet ways in which people endured, and even found meaning. The home of an ordinary Egyptian was simple, often built from mud brick, which was shaped from Nile silt mixed with straw and left to dry in the sun. Walls were thick enough to keep out the heat of the day, though they cracked with time and required constant repair. Roofs were flat, sometimes used as sleeping spaces during the hottest nights, when the air indoors grew stifling. The floors were bare, perhaps covered with mats woven from reeds. Furniture was sparse: low stools, wooden chests, perhaps a small table or a bed frame if the family could afford it. A household was alive with constant activity. Women prepared meals in open courtyards, tending clay ovens or simple fire pits. The staple of the diet was bread, made from emmer wheat or barley, ground by hand each morning. This grinding was no small task. Women bent over heavy quernstones, moving an upper stone back and forth over the lower until the grains became flour. The process was dusty, leaving flour in the air, coating hair and skin. It was tiring, repetitive, and essential. From this flour came bread, baked in clay molds set against hot coals. The loaves were dense and hearty, though often gritty, as sand and chaff mixed into the flour during grinding. To eat bread was to chew not only grain but the desert itself. Alongside bread, beer was brewed in most homes. Unlike the beer of today, it was thick, almost porridge-like, made from partially baked loaves crumbled into water and left to ferment. This drink was consumed daily, by adults and children alike. for it was nourishing and often safer than water. Vegetables added some variety. Onions, leeks, garlic, and cucumbers grew well in Egyptian soil, their sharp flavors brightening otherwise plain meals. Lentils and chickpeas offered protein when meat was scarce. Dates, figs, and melons provided sweetness, though they were seasonal. Meat and fish were eaten less often by ordinary families, reserved for festivals or special occasions. Fish from the Nile might be dried or salted to preserve it, but even this required effort and resources. For most, meals were humble, repetitive, and enough only to sustain. Clothing reflected both simplicity and the demands of climate. Men wore kilts of linen, woven from flax fibers grown along the Nile. Women wore long dresses of the same material, their white fabric catching the brightness of the sun. Linen was light and airy, suited to the heat, but it required labor to produce. Flax had to be harvested, soaked, beaten, and spun into thread before being woven into cloth. This work fell often to women, whose spinning wheels and looms were constant companions in the household. Children wore little at all in their early years, their bare skin glistening under the sun as they played along riverbanks or chased animals through dusty streets. Hairstyles marked their Arja distinctive sidelock of youth, where one lock of hair was left long while the rest was shaved or cropped. As they grew, they joined in the work of their parents, learning trades and tasks that would define their adult lives. Jewelry was one of the few adornments that even ordinary people might wear. Strings of beads made from faience, a bright blue-green glazed material, added color to otherwise simple garments. Amulets shaped into symbols of protection were worn against illness, bad luck, or evil spirits. These small charms carried belief in unseen forces, offering reassurance in a world where hardship was constant and much lay beyond human control. Inside the home, the family was both a comfort and a necessity. Husbands and wives worked side by side, their roles distinct but intertwined. A wife's labor in the household was as vital as a husband's labor in the field. Together, they sustained their family against the challenges of drought, flood, and taxation. Children were cherished, though their survival was uncertain. Infant mortality was high, and illness could strike swiftly. Each child who grew to adulthood carried the hopes of their family forward. Another link in the chain of survival. Family gatherings centered on the evening meal. After a day of toil, people sat together, sharing bread, beer, and what modest dishes they had. Stories were told, songs sung, and laughter sometimes rose. Even in households of hardship, music was part of daily life, played on flutes, harps, and drums. Its melodies carried through courtyards, lifting spirits in moments of rest. Festivals brought rare joy and color to otherwise demanding lives. Religious celebrations filled towns with processions, music, and feasting. Offerings were made to gods, prayers lifted for protection and prosperity. For the people, these festivals were not only spiritual but social, chances to gather, celebrate, and taste foods usually out of reach. Roasted meats, fresh fruits, and sweet cakes flavored with honey brightened their tables for a day or two, before the rhythm of labor returned. Yet even in these moments of light, the shadows of hardship lingered. Illness was a constant presence. With limited medicine, many ailments went untreated, and injuries from farm or workshop could linger painfully. Healers relied on herbs, oils, and incantations, blending practical remedies with spiritual appeals. Some treatments helped, others were little more than hope. To fall sick was to risk the stability of the family, for every hand was needed in work. Sleep itself was shaped by both necessity and environment. Families lay on mats of reeds or, if fortunate, wooden bed frames with rope supports. Mosquitoes buzzed in the night, dogs barked in the distance, and the desert air cooled only slowly. Dreams came to the weary, often colored by the beliefs of the day. Egyptians thought dreams could carry messages from the gods, glimpses of the future, or warnings of danger. A troubled dream might send a person to the temple for guidance, searching for meaning in the restless visions of sleep. Amid all of this, resilience was woven into daily existence. People found comfort in ritual, strength in community, and hope in the rhythms of the Nile. Though their lives were burdened with labor, scarcity, and risk, they endured with patience and with small joys. The brutality of life did not erase its beauty, but rather framed it, making every moment of laughter, every song, every shared meal more precious. For the ordinary Egyptian, survival was not taken for granted. It was earned each day, through sweat, through endurance, and through the ties of family and community. Their lives may not have been filled with splendor, but they carried the true weight of Egypt's greatness. Without them, the temples and tombs, the gods and kings, could not have stood. And so we see again that beneath the grand monuments of history lies a quieter story, a story of homes built from mud, bread baked from grain, laughter shared under the stars, and burdens carried without end. A story of lives both fragile and enduring, brutal and beautiful, ordinary and yet essential. Life in ancient Egypt was not only measured in labor and survival, but in the constant presence of fragility. Illness, accident, and sudden loss shadowed each household. For every dawn that brought people to their fields, workshops, or temples, there was the quiet awareness that life could end quickly and without warning. To live in such a world was to be close to death, and yet, at the same time, to weave death into the rhythm of life itself. Medicine in ancient Egypt was both practical and spiritual. Physicians existed, some trained in temples where knowledge was recorded in papyrus scrolls. These physicians studied the body in ways both curious and limited, understanding that the heart was the center of life, yet often mistaking illness for the work of unseen forces. Remedies drew from the plants and minerals of the land. Garlic, onions, and honey were used often, believed to purify and strengthen. Honey, with its natural antibacterial qualities, was applied to wounds, soothing cuts and burns. Herbs such as coriander, fennel, and willow bark found their way into treatments for stomach troubles, fevers, and pain. Yet alongside these practical remedies were incantations and charms, for illness was thought to be not only of the body but of the spirit. A fever might be treated with herbs, but also with words spoken in prayer, or amulets tied around the neck. Physicians often blended healing with ritual, calling upon gods such as Sekhmet, the fierce lioness, goddess of disease and protection, or Thoth, keeper of knowledge. To heal was to combine medicine with faith, for the unseen was thought as powerful as the seen. Common people relied also on home remedies, passed down through generations. A mother might soothe her child's cough with warm honey, or rub oils scented with herbs into aching muscles. The boundary between health and faith was thin, and so every remedy carried not only physical purpose, but also spiritual reassurance. Despite these efforts, life was fragile. Accidents in the fields, wounds from labor, or illnesses from contaminated food and water often proved deadly. Childbirth was perilous for women, and many did not survive it. Infants and children were especially vulnerable, and families carried both the joy of birth and the sorrow of frequent loss. To endure such a world required strength of spirit, and for the Egyptians, that strength was found in their deep belief in the afterlife. Death was not an end, but a passage. To die was to journey to another realm, where the soul would face judgment and, if worthy, continue to live in the field of reeds, a paradise resembling the familiar beauty of the Nile Valley, with fertile fields, cool waters, and endless harvests. This belief gave shape to how Egyptians approached death, weaving it into their daily lives. Even the poorest prepared for burial in some way. A simple grave dug into the earth might be lined with stones, and the body wrapped in linen or red mats. Modest offerings were placed inside, perhaps a clay jar of beer, a loaf of bread, or an amulet for protection. These items, though humble, reflected hope for the journey beyond. For wealthier families, tombs were built of mud brick or stone, with painted walls showing scenes of life meant to continue in eternity. The process of mummification, though most elaborate for the elite, carried a central idea. The body must be preserved so the soul could recognize it in the afterlife. Skilled embalmers removed internal organs, dried the body with natron salt, and wrapped it carefully in linen. Amulets were placed within the wrappings, each symbol holding protective power. For kings and nobles, the process was complex, lasting weeks, with priests chanting prayers to guide the soul. For common people, the process was simpler, sometimes nothing more than natural preservation by desert sands. At the heart of the afterlife lay judgment. The deceased stood before Osiris, Lord of the dead. In the Hall of Truth, the heart, thought to hold a person's character and memory, was weighed against the feather of Mat, the goddess of truth and order. If the heart was light, free from the weight of wrongdoing, the soul entered the field of reeds. If heavy, it was devoured by Ammit, a fearsome creature, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. This belief placed morality at the center of life, for actions carried weight beyond death. For the living, Funerals were moments of both grief and ritual. Families gathered to mourn, women raising their voices in lamentation. Offerings were made, incense burned, prayers spoken. In the case of the wealthy, professional mourners might join, wailing to honor the dead. But whether grand or humble, each burial was a moment of passage, marking the crossing from this world into the next. The tombs of Egypt, from the smallest grave to the grandest pyramid, were more than places of rest. They were bridges between worlds. Painted walls depicted daily life, as if to ensure that farming, feasting, and family continued forever. In these images, the deceased harvested fields, fished in rivers, and sat with loved ones, their lives restored in eternity. The brutality of earthly life, with its hunger and toil, was hoped to be replaced by eternal abundance. Yet for all their care for the afterlife, Egyptians did not neglect the present. Festivals of the dead brought families to tombs, where they offered food and drink, speaking to their ancestors as if they were still present. In this way, the dead remained part of the living community, remembered and honored. That superstition filled daily life as well, shaping how people avoided misfortune. Amulets in the shape of scarabs' eyes or ankhs were worn for protection. Spells were written on papyrus and tucked into homes to guard against illness or bad spirits. Dreams were interpreted as messages, guiding choices or warning of dangers. The unseen was woven tightly into the fabric of life, for in a world of uncertainty, belief offered comfort. But even with such beliefs, the brutality of existence could not be softened entirely. Famines still came. Diseases still spread, death still struck. What endured was the resilience of people who carried these burdens with faith that something greater awaited. Their spirituality did not erase their suffering, but it gave it meaning, and in that meaning, strength was found as the desert winds blew across the land, carrying grains of sand that slowly buried tombs and villages alike. The Egyptians continued their cycle of life and death, generation after generation. Each person, whether farmer or noble, woman or child, lived with the knowledge that death was near, yet also with hope that life beyond would be kinder. To walk among the tombs of Egypt today is to feel this quiet hope. Names carved into stone, prayers written in hieroglyphs, offerings placed long ago, speak of people who sought to endure, not only in life, but in eternity. Their world was brutal, but their belief was unshaken, and through it, they found peace amid hardship. And so, as we reflect on their medicine, their rituals, and their spirituality, we see not only a people enduring the struggles of survival, but also a people who turned suffering into meaning. Life was harsh, but it was never empty. Death was feared, but it was also prepared for with care. In this way, the Egyptians carried their burdens with dignity, shaping a civilization whose memory endures even as their names fade into sand. The world of ancient Egypt, for all its brilliance, could never remain untouched by the forces that govern every civilization: conflict, change, and decline. Even in a land that seemed eternal, with pyramids rising like mountains of stone and temples carved deep into cliffs, the truth of impermanence whispered through the centuries. Warfare was not constant in Egypt, but when it came, it left deep marks. The Nile, with its rich valley, was a treasure coveted by neighboring peoples, tribes from deserts to the east, warriors from Nubia to the south, and later, more distant powers all sought the wealth and stability that Egypt seemed to hold. Egyptians themselves raised armies when threatened, and sometimes extended their reach beyond their borders, building empires of their own. The site of war in the ancient world was not the grand clash of modern imagination, but the weariness of men carrying simple weapons, the heat of the desert pressing upon them as they marched. Chariots rattled across dry plains, archers loosed arrows under the burning sun, and shields lifted in defense against blades. For ordinary people, war often meant disruption, fields left untended, food supplies strained, and families uncertain of what tomorrow would bring. Yet even in conflict, Egyptians brought with them the same spiritual framework that guided every other part of their lives. Soldiers prayed to gods for strength, wore amulets for protection, and believed that valor in battle might be remembered in eternity. War was harsh, but it was woven into the cycle of life, just as flood and drought were. Environmental challenges, too, tested Egypt's endurance. The Nile was the source of life, but it could also betray. In years when the river's flood was too low, crops failed, and famine spread. Hunger weighed heavily upon the people, especially the poor, who had little stored for lean seasons. Bread and beer, the staples of daily diet, became scarce, and families struggled to survive at times. The river's floods were too great, washing away homes and damaging the very fields it usually nourished. This delicate balance of water shaped everything, reminding Egyptians that their lives rested on forces beyond their control. Priests watched the river carefully, offering prayers and rituals, while officials measured its rise and fall. Still, no ritual could stop the cycles of nature, and people endured them with patience and hope. That as centuries passed, Egypt faced not only the challenges of hunger and war, but also the weight of its own vastness. The great monuments required labor, the ruling elite demanded loyalty, and the distance between wealth and poverty grew wider. Peasants bore the burden of feeding the kingdom, while the upper classes enjoyed luxuries beyond imagining. This imbalance bred unrest, sometimes erupting in quiet rebellion or in the simple act of refusing labor. The arrival of foreign powers brought new changes. Libyans, Assyrians, Persians, and eventually Greeks and Romans came to rule the land. Each left their mark, shaping Egypt's culture while drawing from its deep well of tradition. For common people, life continued with familiar rhythms, fields still planted, bread still baked, prayers still whispered, but under rulers who spoke new languages and brought new gods alongside the old. To live through these transitions was to feel both loss and continuity. The grandeur of the pyramids faded into ruins, their original gleam of white limestone long stripped away. Temples crumbled, statues toppled, and yet the Nile still flowed, and the people still adapted. What endured was not the permanence of stone, but the resilience of human life, adjusting and surviving as it always had, through decline and conquest. The Egyptians carried with them the same beliefs that had guided their ancestors. Death was still a passage, the afterlife still awaited, and every offering, every prayer, every careful wrapping of linen was made with the same hope. In this way, even as kingdoms fell, the people remained tethered to meaning. Looking back now, across the thousands of years that separate us from them, the story of ancient Egypt feels both distant and familiar. Their world was brutal in ways we can scarcely imagine, laboring under burning suns, facing hunger, fearing sickness, mourning the loss of children, enduring the will of kings and conquerors. And yet, they loved, they celebrated, they dreamed, and they built a vision of eternity that still stirs us today. Their monuments, though weathered, continue to rise from the desert, whispering of a civilization that refused to be forgotten. Their writings, carved in stone or inked on papyrus, tell of lives lived with dignity, struggle, and hope. Their art, painted in vibrant colors, still shows scenes of farming, fishing, feasting, and family, ordinary moments transformed into eternal ones. As we close this long journey through their world, imagine once more the calm flow of the Nile at twilight. The sky turns shades of soft pink and deep gold. The air cools after the day's heat, and villagers return home from their fields. Smoke rises gently from cooking fires. Children laugh in the distance, and the slow rhythm of life continues, as it has for centuries. In that moment, the brutality of their existence softens, and what remains is the enduring humanity that connects us across time. They, like us, sought meaning in their struggles, comfort in their beliefs, and beauty in their and though their world was harsh, they found ways to endure, leaving behind a story that still flows, like the Nile itself, unbroken. So as you rest now, letting these images drift through your thoughts, allow yourself to feel the calm of their world. The weight of history eases, the struggles of daily life fade, and what lingers is the gentle reassurance that humanity, in every age, finds its way through. Rest, then, with the memory of ancient Egypt not as a land of endless toil alone, but as a civilization of resilience, of beauty, and of quiet hope. Let their story become a soft backdrop, guiding you into dreams, just as the Nile guided them through the ages.